March 15, 1623. Istanbul is still cloaked in the deepest part of night. The sky is a black so heavy it seems to swallow the light from the torches. Behind doors of Lebanese cedar, reinforced with bands of Damascus steel, deep within Topkapı Palace, a scream tears through the silence. This is not the cry of a woman giving life. It is not the wail of mourning. This is the raw sound of a human mind shattering into pieces. The gods posted outside are hardened men. They have stood watch over battlefield deaths. They have witnessed executions. They know every shade of human agony. Yet at this sound they take 3 unified steps back from the door, 3 full steps. One of these men would later confide in his private journal, a document uncovered centuries later in Anatolia. I have heard men die by the sword. But I have never heard anything like what I heard that night. It was the sound of a soul trying to claw its way out of its own flesh. The girl screaming is 15 years old. Her name is Fatma Sultan. She is the daughter of the most powerful man in the known world, and the granddaughter of a woman who would command an empire from behind latticed screens. Just 3 months ago, Fatma was writing scholarly papers on the movement of celestial bodies. Tonight, she is learning the brutal meaning of being a coin in her father's treasury. This is not a story about a wedding night. This is the story of a machine, a device engineered with chilling precision to transform human beings into instruments of state policy. The method trauma was so systematic, so calculated, that it makes modern psychological operations seem crude by comparison. What you are about to hear was sealed away in coded archives for nearly 400 years. The real question is not why they hid it. The real question is how many other truths are still buried. Before we go further, let me say this. I know you're here for the story, but every view, every like, every subscription to Crimson Historians is more than just a signal to an algorithm. It is a vote that says, yes, show me the history that unsettles me. Show me the truths my textbooks left out. Now, back to Istanbul. Back to the night that changed everything. The Ottoman Empire was just powerful. It was the gravitational center of 3 continents. When Istanbul spoke, Venice strained to listen. When the Sultan's expression darkened, kings in Vienna lost sleep. And within this empire, in the marble heart of Topkapı Palace, there existed a section called the Imperial Harem. You've heard of it. You think you know what it was. You don't. It was a parallel government, a shadow state where the Sultan's mother, his wives, his daughters, and hundreds of enslaved women lived under rules more complex than any European court. Some of these women held more real power than the empire's chief ministers. But there was a catch. Power had its rules. And for the Sultan's daughters, those rules were written upon their own bodies. Fatma Sultan was born in 1606 to Sultan Ahmed Dayan Qasim Sultan. Qasim was a woman who would become one of the most formidable rulers in Ottoman history, though you will not find that title in the official chronicles. She ruled from the shadows for 4 decades. She made sultans. She also broke them. But even Qasim, the master of the political game, could not shield her own daughter from the machine. By the age of 10, Fatma was fluent in 4 languages. She could debate theology in Persian, compose Arabic poetry so elegant it intimidated the court poets, and discuss Greek philosophy from the original texts. Palace astronomers noted she asked questions about planetary orbits that would not be formally answered until Kepler's theories reached the Ottoman court years later. She kept dozens of journals filled with observations of moon phases, sketches for architectural improvements, and philosophical queries about time itself. One entry from December 1620 reads, if the stars move in perfect circles, why does time feel like a downward spiral? Father says I think too much for a girl. Mother says nothing, but her eyes tell me she knows a secret. I wish the stars could warn me of what is coming. They could not. In December 1622, Fatma was summoned to the innermost chamber of the harem. No warning. No explanation. Her mother Qasim Sultan was there. The woman who had orchestrated coups, survived assassination attempts, and outlasted her enemies with the patience of stone eroding water, sat with her back perfectly straight, her face a mask. The announcement was delivered by Gul Enir Hatun, a woman whose title has no clean English translation. She was an architect of psychological control, and she had been perfecting her craft for 30 years. The decision has been made, Gul Enir said in a voice utterly devoid of emotion. You will marry Kara Mustafa Pasha. The wedding will be on March 15th. Preparations begin tomorrow. Karam Mustafa Pasha, a military commander, 20 years older than Fatma, his face scarred from 3 different campaigns. A man whose reputation was built on efficiency and breaking things swiftly and completely. For him, this marriage was a promotion, a reward for loyalty. For Fatma, it was a death sentence dressed in a wedding gown. Fatma did not speak. She looked to her mother. Qasim's face remained stern. That silence was its own answer. What followed was not mere preparation for marriage. It was a dismantling by design. And you know the worst part of this story? It's not that it happened. It's that we almost lost it forever. Someone multiple summons worked very hard to ensure you would never hear what I am about to tell you. Every time you scroll past a story because it's too heavy, you participate in that eros work. You let the cover minus up continue. If you believe the voices the powerful tried to silence deserve to be heard, stay with me. Forgetting is how we let history repeat. Now let me show you what those 3 months of preparation truly meant. The room they took her to was called the Jel and Odias, the bride's chamber. The name was a lie. It was not a chamber. It was a laboratory. Every detail had been calculated over generations. The walls were paneled in dark ebony, chosen because it absorbs light, making the space feel like it is closing in. The carpets were so thick they swallowed all sound. The windows were covered not with curtains, but with heavy wooden shutters nailed shut. The only light came from oil lamps placed at precise angles. Modern psychologists who have studied the architectural plans say this lighting was designed to cause disorientation, bright enough to see, but arranged so you could never tell the hour or how much time had passed. On the walls hung tapestries, not decorative ones. Each depicted a story from Islamic history about the ideal wife. Women who sacrificed everything. Women who obeyed without question. Women who found joy only in their husband's approval. It was visual propaganda running on a continuous loop. Delenia Hatton entered the room like a headmistress presiding over an execution. 60 years old, her face like stone from Cappadocia. In her hands was a leather-bound book in Ottoman script. It had no title on the cover. Inside were detailed instructions for erasing a person's autonomous will while keeping the body intact. The manual had been refined over 80 years. Fatma was the 18th princess to undergo this specific version. Stand. Gull Annie are commanded. For the next 4 hours, Fatma learned the 18 postures of humility. These were not simple bows. Each had specific angles, specific meanings, a code of submission systemated like mathematics. The greeting bow, a 30-degree neck tilt, hands below the heart, eyes down. Message, I am grateful for your attention. The serving bow, 45 degrees, hands extended, palms up. Message, I exist to fulfill your needs. The retiring bow, full prostration for head to ground. Message, I disappear when you wish it. For hours a day. Every day. For 3 months. Modern kinds ILOgists who have studied these postures say they are designed to create embodied submission. When your body's muscle memory overrides your conscious resistance, your mind may want to stand tall, but your trained muscles betray you, pulling you into submission automatically. By the 3rd week, Fatma's body was bowing before her mind could even form the thought to resist. That was the point. Next, they came for her voice. 40-3 words. That is what Fatma's entire vocabulary was reduced to. Not 40-3 types of words. 40-3 specific, written phrases she was permitted to speak. Yes, my lord. As you wish. Forgive my inadequacy. Thank you for your mercy. I am honored by your attention. 40-3 ways to disappear while still making sound. Any deviation, any attempt to speak outside this list brought punishment. The first time, forced fasting for 20-4 hours. The second time, the reflection cell, a space barely large enough to sit in, pitch black for 6 hours. The third time, public humiliation before the entire female household. Over 300 women, while senior concubines listed her failures, her inadequacies, her worthlessness as a royal daughter. By the 5th week, Fatma had stopped trying to speak anything else. The girl who once debated scholars could no longer form a sentence of her own. Twice a week, there was a ceremony called the Lesson in Perspective. Here's what that meant. Fatma Sultan, daughter of the ruler of the world, was required to personally serve her father's favorite concubines. Not symbolically. She washed them, combed their hair, dressed them in the garments they would wear for their private meetings with her father, fed them by hand like a servant feeding nobility. A witness account from a junior attendant, who later left the palace, reads the princess shook so violently while fastening the ruby necklace on the Ruba Sultan that the stones rattled like dice in a cup. She wept without making a sound. I have never seen a human being cry so silently. It was like watching a ghost mourn its own death. This was not random cruelty. This was systematic psychological warfare with one goal: destroy the princess's sense of rank, worth, and identity. Make her understand in her bones that even the enslaved women who shared her father's bed held more value than she did. By the 8th week, Fatma's hands no longer shook when she dressed the concubines. Not because she accepted it, but because a part of her had simply stopped being present. Beneath the harem, in rooms omitted from all official palace maps, they had constructed replicas, exact copies of a bridal chamber. Within these rooms stood mannequins, not simple forms, but disturbingly detailed models commissioned from Venetian craftsmen who specialized in anatomical figures for medical schools. Here, Fatma, mind already fracturing from months of systematic conditioning, was brought twice a week. Under the watch of elderly women taking notes in Persian, she was required to rehearse, to practice scenarios no child should ever know exist. Every reaction was documented. Subject displayed fear response. Session extended. Subject exhibited tears. Additional conditioning required. Subject showed physical resistance. Increased sessions ordered. They were compiling a manual, a technical guide on ensuring the wedding night proceeded without incident. One such manual was discovered in the Topkapı archives in 2019. It reads like a clinical textbook, horrifying in its bureaucratic precision. A psychologist who reviewed it stated it resembles a CIA interrogation manual from the 1952s, except this one was penned in 1623. 7 days before the wedding, Fatma was moved to an isolated pavilion in the palace gardens, the Guluenkusku. No one could enter or leave. No outside sound could penetrate. Her diet was now regulated by the ounce, not for health, but for mood control. Pomegranate, honey, almonds, goat's milk, and exotic spices from Yemen. Modern analysis of similar historical recipes suggests these spices contain compounds we now recognize as mild sedatives and natural anxiolytic substances that induce a dreamlike compliance. She bathed twice daily in waters infused with valerian root, poppy extract, and orange blossom, not for cleanliness, but for chemical sedation. The walls were covered in mirrors, expensive Venetian glass, strategically placed. Everywhere Fatma looked, she saw herself, watching herself, policing herself. It was a Sufi technique called muraqabah, self-observation for spiritual growth. Here, it was weaponized, turning the victim into her own guard. On the final night, they gave her a special tea. The recipe, recovered from palace medical records, contained concentrated poppy milk, crushed mandrake root, and a third substance historians believe was an early dissociative compound. The goal was not sleep. The goal was separation. Mind from body, present in flesh, absent in spirit. As she drank it alone in that mirrored pavilion, Fatma's last coherent thought scrawled in her journal hours before was this: tonight the stars will still move. Tomorrow they will still be there, but I will not be able to see them anymore. Not truly. The girl who loved the stars is about to become someone else, someone I do not know. Mother says this is what it means to be a woman of power. If this is power, I would rather be a slave with a soul. Then, the mental fog descended, and the girl who loved the stars ceased to exist. March 15, 1623, Istanbul celebrated. The entire city was a spectacle. Processions wound through streets perfumed with burning frankincense. Musicians from 3 continents competed to be heard over the roar of 100,000 people. In Topkapı's grand halls, mountains of fruit-covered tables, made of Lebanese cedar, whole roasted lambs, towers of fruit, pastries dripping with honey. The Janissaries, the empire's elite soldiers, performed martial demonstrations, their swords flashing in choreographed combat that drew cheers like a theater performance. Coins were thrown to the crowds. Prisoners were released in honor of the Union. The city was drunk on the glory of imperial power. And in a private chamber, Fatma sat motionless. Court physicians monitored her. Their notes from that afternoon read: pulse weak, irregular. Skin cold despite braziers. Eyes unfocused, tracking movement poorly. Subject appears conscious but unresponsive to direct questions. Sedative tea administered as per protocol. Proceeding to ceremony. She was awake, but she was not present. When night fell, the public celebration ended. The private ritual began. The structure, built over 150 years earlier during the reign of Mehmed the Conqueror, was 3 stories tall and octagonal, each floor designed for a specific phase of the ceremony. Fatma was escorted by a procession of women carrying candles through darkened gardens. The only sound was the rustle of fabric. No one spoke. At the entrance they paused. In that brief silence, perhaps 5 seconds, a younger attendant would later swear she heard Fatma whisper something. Not in Ottoman Turkish but in Greek. A prayer to Artemis, the Virgin Goddess. A prayer from a time before Islam, before the Empire. A prayer older than the palace itself. Lady of the Moon, if you can hear me, let me die before dawn. Then they entered. For 3 hours, she was washed in waters steaming with Damascus rose, jasmine, sandalwood, and Somali amber. The ointments applied to her skin were not merely perfume. Modern forensic analysis shows similar preparations contain diluted opium derivatives, causing what physicians today call dissociative euphoria, where the body functions, but the conscious mind retreats into a waking dream. The Gullah body that would not resist, even as the mind screamed silently. One attendant recorded the princess did not struggle. She did not react. Her eyes were open, but she did not see us. It was like bathing a beautiful corpse. Then came the wedding dress. White silk embroidered with gold thread, pearls from the Persian Gulf. A crown so heavy its sheer weight forced her head down. But hidden within the splendor were internal cords binding her torso, restricting deep breaths, clasps designed to make the garment impossible to remove without help, weighted jewelry that functioned as restrained shoes with thick, unbalanced soles that made running impossible. The wedding dress was a prison in disguise. Meanwhile, in another chamber, Kara Mustafa Pasha received his own instructions. Senior military advisors, veterans of a dozen campaigns, taught him specific phrases to establish dominance, physical positioning techniques, methods of intimidation refined on battlefields. He was not being prepared for love. He was being prepared for conquest. The same tactics used to break enemy commanders were now to be applied to a 15-year-old girl. Ziyah they called it. The Ascension. The room's walls were covered in tapestries depicting military victories, cities sacked, armies crushed, princesses captured in war. The message was explicit: what happens in war will happen here. The bed was fitted with concealed ropes for safety. Cushions were soaked in sedative oils. The lighting was controlled for maximum psychological impact. Behind carved wooden screens, witnesses waited, physicians and scribes, their job to document the marriage's consummation, to ensure the machine had worked. The doors closed. What happened next was recorded in encrypted medical notes, written in Persian and sealed for centuries. I will tell you what they say, not for entertainment, but because erasing these girls' suffering is precisely what the Empire intended. And we refuse to let that erasure stand. The physicians documented complete physical and psychological collapse within the first hour. Their notes continue: subject's body exhibited severe tremors. Voice disappeared entirely. No sound produced despite apparent attempts at speech. Eyes rolled back. Consciousness flickered between present and absent states. The primary male participant initially interpreted the subject state as defiance and employed recommended intimidation techniques. Subject showed no responsive resistance, not due to compliance, but due to apparent psychological absence. After 3 hours of failed attempts, additional sedatives were administered. Physical consummation was achieved only after the subject entered what we term shock, MOT, absolute shock, a state where the body continues to function while conscious awareness appears to have completely withdrawn. There is a modern term for this dissociative shutdown. It is what the mind does when trauma becomes so overwhelming that consciousness itself becomes the enemy. The mind abandons the body to protect itself, even though that protection is an illusion. The final medical note, written near dawn, states internal injuries documented. Repeated loss of consciousness. Subject's pulse dangerously weak. What we observed tonight was not a wedding night. It was what we term Ran CKM as the departure of the soul. Consummation achieved. Marriage sealed. The physical body remains functional. The person who entered this chamber, however, did not survive the night. When dawn broke, Istanbul celebrated a successful royal wedding. Coins were thrown, blessings recited in mosques, poetry composed praising the union. And in her pavilion, Fatma sat in silence, staring at nothing. The girl had died, not her body. That would linger for 20-9 more years. But everything that had made her Fatma was gone. I need you to pause for a second. What you just heard is not fiction. It is not exaggeration. It is documented in medical journals, architectural records, and witnessed testimonies. These girls existed. Their suffering was real. Then, for centuries, its suffering was deliberately hidden. What matters right now is that you are still here. That you have not looked away because it is uncomfortable. If you have made it this far, you understand something. History is not supposed to make you comfortable. It is supposed to make you aware. Subscribe to Crimson Historians. Not for me. For every Fatma whose story almost vanished forever, that night was just the beginning. The years that followed would reveal a truth far more complex than anyone imagined. The morning after the wedding, palace physicians were alarmed. Not because something had gone wrong, but because it had gone too perfectly according to their design. Fatma had developed what they clinically termed selective mutism. She did not speak at all. When directly commanded by Gul Ner Hatman or her new husband, she would respond in barely audible whispers, using only those 40-3 permitted phrases. But voluntary speech was gone. Her appetite vanished. She had to be force-fed like an infant, with attendants literally placing food in her mouth and massaging her throat to induce swallowing. Then came the episodes. Without warning, Fatma would begin weeping hours-long sessions where her whole body shook with sobs, yet produced no sound. Attendants described it as watching someone drown in air. But worse than the silent crying was the terror. The presence of any man triggered what the physicians called fear sickness. If a eunuch she had known her entire life entered the room, she would immediately hyperventilate, break into extreme sweats, and collapse. Her own father could not be in the same space with her. Guard shifts had to be reorganized. Male servants were reassigned. Her entire existence was restructured around this overwhelming, body-minus destroying fear of male presence. The physicians tried everything: herbal tinctures, music therapy, Sufi spiritual exercises, experimental treatments involving magnets and special diets. Nothing worked. You cannot heal a shattered mind by treating only the body. The girl who once filled journals with astronomical observations saw those volumes locked in a chest, never opened again. Her calligraphy instruments, tools she had used to create art that made court poets envious, gathered dust on a shelf. The palace gardens she had loved to explore, she now refused to enter them. Every piece of who she had been was systematically erased. On paper, Fatma's marriage to Kerem Mustafa Pasha continued. There were children, 4 of them. Their conceptions were described in the medical records with the same chilling, clinical detachment as the wedding night. Subject tented dissociative state. Consummation achieved. Subject unresponsive for hours afterward. 4 children were born to a mother who was not present, even in spirit, for their making. There were public appearances, state functions where Fatma stood silent and still as a porcelain doll, wearing whatever they dressed her in, moving only when positioned. The illusion of normality was maintained for political necessity, but private records from palace staff tell a different story. Kerem Mustafa Pasha began spending longer and longer periods away on military campaigns. He turned to opium, then to other women. Some accounts suggest he repeatedly requested assignments to the most dangerous frontiers: Hungary, Persia, Yemen. A letter to a military colleague, discovered in Austrian archives, reads, "They gave me a bride and told me it was a reward. What they gave me was a ghost wearing a crown. I cannot look at her without seeing what I was made to do. Send me to the frontier. Send me anywhere. Let me die in battle like a soldier, not in shame like a coward." He was haunted. She was destroyed. And the empire called it a successful marriage. Fatma lived 20-9 more years in this state of half-death. A ceremonial ornament. A womb for future political pawns. A living lesson in what it meant to be born female in a system that valued women only as currency. On March 15, 1652, exactly 20-9 years to the day after her wedding night, she died. Physicians recorded the cause as brain fever, but the precision of the date was no coincidence. Palace staff whispered that she had simply decided on that grim anniversary that she had carried the weight of memory long enough, that after 20-9 years of living as a ghost, she had finally given herself permission to stop. Her death was marked with appropriate ceremony, and then she was forgotten. Official Ottoman chronicles barely mention her. One line summarizes her life: Fatma Sultan, wife of Kara Mustafa Pasha, mother of 4 children, died in the year 1652. She was noted for her piety and obedience. The brilliant astronomer erased, the gifted polyglot poet erased, the curious philosophical intellect erased, replaced with 4 words: piety and obedience. That is what they wanted you to remember. That is what we are here to correct. Here's what haunts me about this story. It is not just that it happened, it is how perfectly it worked. The Ottoman court understood something modern psychology only formally codified in the 20th century. The most effective control is not physical restraint. It is psychological conditioning that makes the victim police herself. It turns resistance into an impossibility her own mind will not allow. They built a machinery system so efficient at breaking autonomous, will let it operated for nearly 3 centuries with only minor adjustments. At least 30-7 documented princesses underwent variations of this process between 1530 and 1826. 30-7 brilliant, educated, potentially powerful women, each dismantled with the same clinical precision. And this machine did not stop at the borders of the Ottoman Empire. Similar systems existed, less documented, less systematic, but functionally identical in other royal courts. Imperial China's foot-binding was not merely about aesthetics, it was about enforced immobility, control through deliberate physical limitation. European royal courts had their own bridal preparation rituals that historical records hint at but never fully describe. Aristocratic families across the world used marriage as a political tool, with preparation that often meant breaking their daughter's will. The specifics differed. The goal was always the same: to transform a person into an instrument. What disturbs me most is not the past, but how thoroughly it was hidden. The same system that destroyed these women also erased their suffering from history. It replaced screams with ceremonies, trauma with triumph, victims with venerated wives. For centuries, the official story went unchallenged. It was not until 2019 that researchers finally pieced together the full scope of what happened in those chambers. Think about that. How many other truths are still buried? How many voices are still silenced? How many times have you read a history book that glorified a royal alliance without ever questioning what that phrase truly meant for the bride? The story of Fatma Sultan is a stark reminder. History is not merely the tale of emperors and their conquests. It is also the muffled echo of the silenced, the buried record of pain that powerful institutions tried to erase, the truth that survives despite every effort to smother it. When we recover these stories, we do more than correct the historical record. We honor the humanity that was denied. We speak the names that were forgotten. We refuse to let suffering become invisible simply because its concealment was convenient for those in power. There is a quote attributed to Qasim Sultan herself, Fatma's mother, found in a private letter within French archives: "I have ruled an empire from the shadows. I have made sultans and unmade them. I have survived assassins and outlasted enemies. But I could not protect my daughter from the very machine I helped to build." That is the price of power. You feed the machine, and eventually, it feeds on you. You have just witnessed one of history's darkest truths. A preparation ritual designed to manufacture perfect obedience, which became systematic psychological torture. A wedding night that should have been a celebration, which became the source of a lifetime of trauma. A brilliant young woman who dreamed of studying the stars, who spent 20-9 years as a ghost of her from herself, and who died on the exact anniversary of the night her spirit was killed. If this story has reminded you of how fragile humanity can be, if it makes you angry that this truth was hidden for centuries, if you believe that the voices the powerful tried to silence deserve to be heard, then act. Subscribe to Crimson Historians. Leave a comment below with the name of another royal woman whose hidden story you believe should be exposed. Share this video. Your attention, your voice decides which buried truth gets told next. Because the most dangerous thing about history is not what we do not know, it is what we have been deliberately, systematically prevented from knowing. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you've been told. The truth is always darker, stranger, and more profoundly human than the official version allows. Fatma Sultan's story is not an isolated tragedy. It is a single, horrifically clear window into a vast and silent system. To understand the true scale, we must follow the echoes of this machine beyond the gilded cages of Topkapı. The economic engine of silence. The preparation of royal brides was not just a cultural practice, It was a cornerstone of imperial economics. A successfully processed princess was a stable political asset. A marriage secured an alliance. Her conditioned obedience prevented scandal. And her children became valuable pawns. The entire apparatus, the trainers like Gull and Er Hat-un, the physicians, the craftsmen of restrictive garments, the suppliers of sedative spices formed a specialized economy. Archives show invoices for tranquilizing unguents and payments to conductors of comportment. The suffering was bureaucratized, itemized, and budgeted for. This system ensured that the human costs never appeared on the empire's balance sheets, only the political profit. The manuals of control. The discovery of the 1623 manual was not a fluke. Fragmentary documents from earlier periods suggest a continuous process of refinement. A page from a 1587 manual found in a Cairo archive details voice modulation exercises for a princess destined for a marriage in Crimea. It chillingly notes the subject's natural laugh is too bright, too free. It must be softened to a tone of subdued pleasure. Another from 1710 outlines a graded exposure system to male presence, starting with the scent of a man's perfume on a cloth, progressing to hearing a recorded male voice, a technological marvel for the time. All designed to numb the terror response they themselves had installed. These were not acts of barbarism born of ignorance, they were applied social science, centuries ahead of its time and its ruthless efficacy. The survivors who became perpetrators. The system's most insidious feature was its ability to co-opt its own victims. Some princesses who survived the process broke and reshaped, later ascended to positions of influence as Valide Sultan's queen mothers. Their psychological makeup, now wired for survival within the machine's logic, often lead them to enforce the same system on the next generation. They became its most zealous guardians, believing or forcing themselves to believe that this was necessary, even righteous pain. A letter from a 17th-century Venetian ambassador observes the mother of the Sultan rules with an iron will. Yet she is the first to insist on the harsh conditioning of her granddaughters. It is as if she seeks to prove the necessity of her own chasitude by replicating it. The cycle of trauma became self-perpetuating, dressed in the robes of tradition and statecraft. Global reflections in the mirror. While the Ottoman system was uniquely documented and systemated, its shadow fell across the globe. Consider the fate of Catherine of Aragon, sent to England as a young bride to Prince Arthur. Historical focus is on her later marriage to Henry VII, but her early years were marked by a rigorous, isolating Anglicization process meant to erase her Spanish identity and will, preparing her as a political vessel. In the Mughal Empire, royal women underwent elaborate Purdah seclusion training that extended far beyond physical seclusion to encompass psychological reshaping for a life of confined influence. In Japan, the brides of shoguns underwent Okoto training, learning a highly stylized, restricted court language that controlled not just what they said, but how they could even think of expressing it. The archaeologists of pain. How do we recover these stories? The work of modern historians like those of crimson historians is akin to forensic archaeology. We don't just read the official chronicles, we read against them. We study palace architecture, the design of isolated pavilions, rooms with specific acoustics for silencing sound, and mirrored chambers. Material culture, the chemical residue on perfume bottles, the biomassances of restrictive clothing, the dietary lists in kitchen ledgers. Marginalia, the scribbles in the margins of medical texts, the private diaries of junior attendants, the coded complaints in diplomatic letters. Biomolecular history, emerging studies even analyze stress hormones trapped in centuries-old hair samples, seeking physical proof of sustained trauma. This multidisciplinary approach allows us to hear the whispers in the walls that official history tried to plaster over. Why your attention is the antidote. For centuries, the strategy was simple: make the truth too painful, too dark, too inconvenient to look at. They relied on societal preference for glittering myths over grim realities. Every time you choose to watch, to read, to share a story like Fatma's, you break that strategy. You create a demand for unvarnished truth. You tell algorithms and institutions that humanity's full story, not just the victories of the powerful, but the silent suffering used to build those victories as value. The machine relied on silence. Our weapon is attention. Coming next, the daughters of Fatma. In our next investigation, we will trace the lives of Fatmas for children, raised by a ghost-mother in a court of shadows. How did they navigate the world? Did the trauma echo through generations? One became a powerful governor, another died in suspicious circumstances. Their stories reveal how the damage inflicted by the machine rippled outwards, shaping politics, wars, and the fate of the emperor itself. The story did not end with Fatma's death. It mutated. Your voice directs our research. The archive is vast. Which thread should we pull next? Comment Hurrem to explore how the most famous Ottoman consort, Hurrem Sultan, navigated and possibly weaponized this system from within. Comment Mughal to dive into the parallel world of psychological control in the palaces of Delhi and Agra. Comment Physicians to uncover the dark ethical history of the port doctors who documented trauma while facilitating it. Subscribe and join us. Together we are not just learning history, we are reclaiming it.